Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale is a journey of love, loss, and redemption. Today's story is about a mother's heartbreaking decision, a child's fight for survival, and the transformative power of forgiveness. It's a story that will remind you of the strength of the human spirit and the unconditional love that can heal even the deepest wounds. Stay with us as we dive into the life of Grace, a little girl abandoned in the forest, and the family that gave her a second chance. Let's begin today's story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated with more inspiring life stories. The wind was soft that evening, as if it knew the weight of the sorrow hanging in the air. Emma lay in her modest cottage, weak from the delivery, her face pale and damp with sweat. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling under the weight of exhaustion. The small cottage, nestled at the edge of a forest, stood silent as if waiting for something to happen. From the moment she had heard the cries of her newborn, Emma had felt something in her heart stir, a connection, a bond. But as the village midwife, an elderly woman named Mama Esther, wrapped the tiny bundle and placed it in Emma's arms, something felt off. Emma looked down at her child with confusion. It wasn't the joy she had expected to feel. No, there was only a heavy silence in the room. "It's a girl," Mama Esther said softly, her voice full of warmth. "A beautiful one." Emma weakly lifted her head to look at the tiny face in her arms. She saw the baby's innocent features, her little hands moving aimlessly, her face still and unblinking. But there was no response, no connection. Emma's heart sank. Something wasn't right. She had expected the baby to look at her, to give some sign of recognition. But the baby did not. Emma felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. Mama Esther, sensing Emma's distress, waved her hand in front of the child's face, her movements gentle, as if hoping for some sign that would reassure Emma. But all that followed was a sigh, long and heavy. She does not see," Mama Esther said softly. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? Is she blind?" "Your daughter is blind," Mama Esther confirmed, her voice tinged with sadness. Emma's world seemed to collapse in that instant. She looked down at the baby, her tiny face so innocent, so vulnerable. A mother's heart should have been filled with love and joy. But instead, Emma felt a deep, overwhelming sense of fear. Her baby couldn't see her. Would she ever live a normal life? Would anyone ever accept her? Emma's hands trembled as she cradled the baby closer to her chest. Outside, a murmur of voices rose from the women of the village, gathered just beyond the cottage walls. Emma could already hear the whispers that would spread like wildfire. "A cursed child," they would say. "A bad omen." Her heart raced as she imagined their cruel judgment. Who would marry a blind girl? Would she ever be able to lead a normal life? The fear that gripped Emma's chest was suffocating. She was alone now. The father of the baby had passed away months ago, leaving her to face this challenge on her own. The night was long. The baby's cries, soft and pitiful, echoed through the silent cottage. Emma lay there, exhausted, unsure of what to do. Fear gnawed at her insides, making her decision even harder. There was no one to help her, no one to guide her. She was on her own in this. And then, through the despair and the tears, a terrible thought crossed Emma's mind. She could not bear to raise a blind child in a world so cruel. She could not bear the shame, the whispers, the constant judgment. Perhaps it would be better to leave the child. Perhaps the world would be better without her. It was then that she made the decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The moon hung high in the sky, casting pale light across the landscape as Emma made her way through the dense forest. Each step felt heavier than the last. She could hear the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of night creatures. But they all seemed to fade away in the face of the weight she carried. In her arms, Lily whimpered softly. Emma's heart ached, but she kept walking, her feet moving as though they were no longer her own. She stopped near an old tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like fingers to the dark sky. Emma looked around, as though hoping for someone to appear, to stop her from what she was about to do. But there was no one, only the cold shadows of the night, watching her in silence. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she knelt down and placed Lily on the soft patch of grass. The baby's cries grew louder, more desperate. Emma felt her heart shatter, the sound cutting through her like a knife. She squeezed her eyes shut, But the tears wouldn't stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't do this." But still, she turned away, forcing herself to walk away. Her body was moving, but her soul felt frozen, as though she could not will herself to leave the baby behind. Each step felt like it might be her last. But she kept going, telling herself that someone would find Lily. Someone would take care of her. The cries grew fainter as Emma disappeared deeper into the forest. But she knew the truth. No one came this far into the woods. No one would come for Lily. Emma had left her there, alone in the dark, where the only sound that would follow her would be the desperate cries of a helpless child. The sound of crickets filled the air as Dr. James rode home that night. His journey had been long, his mind preoccupied with the many children he had treated during the day. Yet, as he passed through the quiet forest path, a sound reached his ears, an unusual sound. The cry of a baby. Faint but distinct. His horse slowed, its hooves crunching softly against the dry earth, as he strained to hear where the sound was coming from. For a moment, he wondered if it was a wild animal, perhaps a fox or some other creature. But there was something different about this sound. It was unmistakable, human. A baby, abandoned, calling out into the night. Dr. James's heart tightened. He couldn't ignore it. Turning his horse toward the sound, he rode deeper into the forest. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above, casting the woods into a veil of shadow. But Dr. James was determined. He knew this path. He had walked it countless times before. And tonight, he knew, he was meant to find something, someone. As he reached a large tree, he spotted something in the grass. A tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. His heart clenched, and without hesitation, he dismounted and hurried over to it. Gently, he pulled back the cloth to reveal the baby. A girl, her small, fragile form trembling in the cold night air. Dr. James's experienced hands recognized the weakness in the baby's body. She was hungry, weak from the elements, and cold, but still alive. He couldn't fathom who would leave a child like this in the forest to fend for herself. With a soft sigh, he cradled her close to his chest. Her cries softened, as if sensing the comfort he offered. For a moment, all that mattered was the warmth he could give her. "Who would leave you here, little one?" Dr. James whispered, rocking her gently. He could feel the weight of her abandonment settle on his heart. The baby quieted, still unsure of her situation, but comforted by his presence. The decision was clear. He couldn't leave her here. He couldn't turn his back on her. Not after what she had endured. So, with the baby safely in his arms, Dr. James climbed back onto his horse and set off toward home. By the time he arrived at his cottage, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. His wife, Sarah, was waiting by the fire, her face soft with concern as she watched him enter. "Samuel, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with the worry of someone who knew him too well. Dr. James smiled faintly, though the heaviness in his heart was hard to ignore. "I found her, in the woods, abandoned." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. "A baby? Who would leave a child like that?" "I don't know," he replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "But she's here now. She needs us." He gently placed the baby in Sarah's arms. The tiny girl seemed so fragile, so vulnerable. Sarah's heart melted as she looked down at the child, her instincts as a mother kicking in. This baby, abandoned by the world, had found a place in their home. A place where she would be loved and cared for. "She's beautiful," Sarah whispered, her fingers brushing against the baby's soft skin. Dr. James looked down at the child, a sense of determination settling over him. "I want to call her Grace. Because, despite everything, she's survived, she's here, and she's a light in our lives." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she held the baby close to her chest. She could feel the weight of their decision. There was no turning back now. Grace was theirs to protect, to love, and to raise as their own. That night, Grace slept in a warm bed, surrounded by the love and comfort of a family who had chosen her. For the first time in her short life, she was safe, and for Dr. James and Sarah, the journey of healing had just begun. They would raise Grace with love, teaching her everything she needed to know, including how to see the world in a way that went beyond the limitations of sight. As the years passed, Grace thrived under the care and love of Dr. James and Sarah. Though she could not see the world with her eyes, she saw it with her heart. Dr. James and Sarah did everything they could to help her grow into a confident and independent young girl. They created a world for her that was full of love, empathy, and understanding. Grace, despite her blindness, never saw herself as lacking. She learned to use her hands to feel the world, to listen to the sounds that others might overlook, and to use her heart to understand what sight could not reveal. The small cottage was always filled with the soft melodies of Grace's music. When she was little, Sarah had introduced her to a wooden flute, a simple, beautiful instrument that would become Grace's most treasured possession. Sarah had always believed that music had a way of reaching the soul in a way words could not. And she wanted Grace to experience that. Even if she couldn't see the notes on a page, Grace felt the smooth wood in her hands, her fingers learning the shape of each note. It was difficult at first, the sounds sharp and unrefined. But Grace was patient. She pressed on, determined to make beautiful music. Day after day, she practiced in the garden, her music flowing through the air like a gentle breeze. Soon, the sounds grew sweeter, more melodic, and the whole village could hear the beautiful notes drifting through the trees. It became a comforting sound, a reminder to everyone who heard it that despite the challenges Grace faced, she was living a full and meaningful life. One evening, as Dr. James sat on the porch, watching Grace play her flute, a thought crossed his mind: what if she could see? The question had been there for some time, lurking in the back of his mind. But it was only now that he dared to voice it. He had treated countless patients. But Grace's case was different. He had always assumed her blindness was permanent, a fate that she would live with forever. But could there be hope? Could something be done? The next morning, Dr. James spent hours poring over medical texts, searching for answers. His hands trembled as he read through each page, looking for any hint of a solution. Finally, after hours of research, he found something that could change everything. There was a possibility that Grace's blindness could be reversed. It wasn't certain, but it was a glimmer of hope. There was a surgery, delicate and complex, that could restore her sight. Dr. James's heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear. The surgery was expensive, far beyond what he and Sarah could afford. He had spent his entire life saving others. But this was different. This was his daughter. The thought of giving her the chance to see the world, to experience it fully, was overwhelming. He would do anything to make it happen. But the cost, it weighed heavily on him. How could they possibly afford such an expensive procedure? He sat in his clinic, the test results in front of him, his mind racing with the possibilities. His love for Grace was immeasurable, and he knew he had to try. He wouldn't let money stand in the way of giving her the chance she deserved. He looked up at Sarah, who had entered the room silently. She saw the worry on his face, the burden of the decision resting on his shoulders. "Samuel, what is it?" she asked softly, sitting beside him. He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. "Grace's blindness, it could be reversible. There's a surgery, but it's so expensive. We don't have that kind of money." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached for his hand. "We'll find a way," she said, her voice full of determination. "She deserves this. We will find a way." Dr. James looked at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "If I have to sell the clinic, I will," he whispered. "Grace deserves the chance to see." And so, their journey to find the funds for the surgery began. Dr. James spoke to friends, asked for loans, and even considered selling his clinic. But the money never seemed to be enough. Yet he refused to give up. Grace's future was at stake, and he would do whatever it took to give her the gift of sight. Days turned into weeks, and Dr. James's relentless search for funds continued. Just when he thought all hope was lost, an unexpected visitor arrived at his clinic. A wealthy businessman, Mr. Benson, whom Dr. James had once treated, entered the room with a kind smile. "I hear you need money, Doctor," Mr. Benson said, his tone sincere. "How much do you need?" Dr. James hesitated, surprised by the offer. "It's a large sum. I don't know if..." Mr. Benson held up his hand. "I owe you my life. Let me return the favor. I'll pay for the surgery." Tears filled Dr. James's eyes as he gripped Mr. Benson's hands. You don't know what this means. Thank you. With the surgery finally possible. The operation was scheduled. The night before, Dr. James and Sarah sat by Grace's side, holding her hands, reassuring her that everything would be all right. The surgery was a success. And when the bandages were removed, Grace blinked into the world for the first time. Her eyes widened as she saw the faces of her parents, Drive, James and Sarah, and the world around her. I can see you, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Dr. James held her tightly, tears streaming down his face. I love you, Grace. You're our light. Years later, Grace had become a young woman full of life and promise. She had everything she needed in her family's love. And though her biological mother had once abandoned her, Grace had learned the power of forgiveness. As she stood outside their home, looking at the sunset, she smiled. Thank you for everything, she whispered to the world, knowing that her journey had led her to a place where love and forgiveness had healed even the deepest wounds. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more life stories that inspire and move the heart.